The hum of the heart-lung machine is a sound I know better than my own breathing. It's the rhythm of my world, a steady, electronic pulse that promises control in a universe of chaos. For 12 years, that sound has been my sanctuary, the operating theater my cathedral. I am a cardiothoracic surgeon, and in my world, problems have solutions. A leaky valve can be replaced, a blocked artery can be bypassed. There is a protocol, a procedure, a precise and elegant dance of clamp and suture that restores order. My hands, steady and sure under the harsh glare of the surgical lights, have held beating hearts. I have stitched life back into bodies that were moments from giving up. It's a profound, almost divine responsibility, and I have carried it with a singular focus that has cost me. Well, it has cost me things. Things I used to tell myself didn't matter as much as the lives I was saving. My days are a blur of pre-op consultations, hours-long surgeries, and post-op check-ins. I speak in acronyms and dosages, my conversations clipped and efficient. Emotion is a luxury, a dangerous variable in an equation that must always be solved. My life outside the hospital had become a series of footnotes to my career. Missed dinners, forgotten anniversaries, calls taken in the middle of conversations. People, I found, eventually learn to expect less of you. They adapt. Or so I thought. My father, a man who built his life with his hands as a master carpenter, was never one for adaptation when it came to principles. And for him, family was a principle, solid and unyielding as the oak he loved to work with. The day of his 70th birthday began like any other. A complex aortic valve replacement on a man in his 50s. The surgery was delicate, a 12-hour marathon that pushed my team and me to our limits. But we succeeded. As I stripped off my scrubs, a wave of triumphant exhaustion washed over me. I felt that familiar godlike feeling, the quiet pride of cheating death one more time. It was only then, seeing the 27 missed calls on my phone, that the other world, the one outside the sterile walls of the hospital, came crashing in. My sister's texts were a frantic staccato of escalating panic. "Where are you? Dad is asking. Everyone's here. We're waiting for you to cut the cake." I looked at the time. 9:47 p.m. The party had started at 6. I drove, my mind still replaying the intricate suture patterns of the surgery. A stark contrast to the simple human obligation I had so spectacularly failed. When I walked into my parents' house, the forced gaiety of the remaining guests fell away, replaced by an awkward silence. The air was thick with disappointment. My father was sitting in his armchair, his shoulders slumped. He looked older than 70. He looked tired. I launched into my apology, the words sounding hollow even to me. I talked about the surgery, the complications, the life that was on the line. I was explaining the procedure, not the reason. I was defending my choice, not acknowledging his hurt. He just watched me, his eyes, usually so full of life and fire, were dull. My mother stood by the dining table, where a magnificent, multi-layered chocolate cake sat, perfectly whole. Not a single slice had been cut. It was a monument to a celebration that never happened. After the last of the guests had shuffled out with quiet goodbyes, I tried again. "Dad, I'm so sorry. Let's cut the cake now, just the three of us." He looked from me to the cake and then back to me. A lifetime of unspoken frustrations seemed to gather in his gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, not with anger, but with a deep, cutting weariness that was far worse. "You know," he began, his voice raspy, "the man whose heart you were fixing today, he has a family. They were probably praying for you. Praying that a stranger would save the man they love." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "You care for strangers more than me." He stood up, slowly, his joints creaking. He didn't look at me again. He just walked out of the room, leaving me standing there with my mother, the untouched cake between us like a tombstone. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of his words, the truth of them, and the sickening realization that I had no protocol, no procedure, to fix what I had just broken. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. My father's words became a ghost that haunted my every move. They were there in the hum of the heart-lung machine, which now sounded less like control and more like a monotonous ticking clock, counting down the moments I was losing. They were in the faces of my patients' families, their hopeful eyes now looking like an accusation. You're here for us, they seemed to say, but who is there for your own? I tried to function. I went to work. I performed surgeries, but my hands, for the first time in my life, felt disconnected from my mind. The rock-solid confidence that had defined me had fractured, and a creeping, insidious doubt seeped in. I was a fraud, a man who could mend the most complex organ in the human body but couldn't mend a simple human relationship. I tried to fix it the way I knew how, logically. I called him. The conversations were stilted, excruciatingly polite. We talked about the weather, about his garden, about everything and nothing. The chasm between us was too wide to be bridged by small talk. His accusation was a living thing in the silence on the line, and neither of us knew how to kill it. I tried to buy my way out of it. I sent him an expensive, top-of-the-line woodworking lathe, something he'd mentioned wanting years ago. A few days later, it was returned. The delivery slip marked, refused. That rejection was more painful than any surgical complication I had ever faced. It was a clear, definitive message. The tools I used to solve problems in my world, logic, money, grand gestures, were useless here. I was failing and the pressure was building. I became irritable at the hospital. I snapped at a resident for a minor mistake. I felt myself losing control, the one thing I cherished above all else. The man who held hearts in his hands was losing his own grip. The breaking point, the moment that would ultimately lead to my salvation, came in the form of a 72-year-old man named Arthur. He was a retired history teacher with a laugh that echoed in the hallways and a heart that was giving out. His case was severe, a triple bypass that was high risk due to his age and the fragility of his arteries. His wife, a small, gentle woman named Eleanor, was his shadow. She sat in the waiting room for days, knitting a misshapen scarf, her brow furrowed with a worry so profound it seemed to physically weigh her down. I saw her as I always saw relatives, as a necessary, often emotional, part of the surgical equation. I gave her my standard pre-op speech, confident, clinical, full of statistics and reassurances but devoid of any real warmth. Arthur's surgery was a nightmare. Every time I thought we were stable, another complication arose. His tissues were like wet paper. A bypass that should have taken 6 hours stretched into 10, then 12. We fought for him minute by bloody minute. Finally, exhausted and drenched in sweat, we pulled him through. He was alive, but his recovery would be a long, arduous road. It fell to me to deliver the news to Eleanor. I found her in the same chair, the scarf now a tangled mess in her lap. I began my usual speech, detailing the technical challenges, the success of the procedure, the guarded prognosis. I was a machine reporting data. But then, she looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed and full of a raw, desperate humanity that pierced through my professional armor. She didn't ask about his ejection fraction or his arterial pressure. She asked, her voice trembling, "Will he still be able to hum?" I stopped, thrown by the question. "Hum?" I repeated, confused. "Yes," she whispered. "He hums when he's happy, especially when he's in his garden, tending to his roses. It's the sound of him. It's the sound of our life. Will I ever hear it again, doctor?" In that moment, everything shattered. Her question wasn't about medicine. It was about love. It was about the small, intimate details that make up a life, the things that no surgical report could ever capture. The humming, the roses. And I saw it all with a blinding, devastating clarity. My father didn't want a new lathe or a belated birthday celebration. He didn't want my explanations about saving lives. He wanted the humming. He wanted his son. He wanted the small, quiet moments that I had dismissed as unimportant in my grand, life-saving crusade. Eleanor wasn't just a patient's wife. She was a mirror. Her fear of losing the sound of her husband's happiness was my own failure, reflected back at me. I had stopped listening for the music in my own life. I had been so focused on the mechanics of the heart that I had forgotten its purpose. To love, to connect, to feel. I stood there in the sterile hospital hallway, and for the first time in years, I felt the sting of tears. I finally saw her, not as a variable, but as a person, terrified of a world without the man she loved. I sat down next to her, not as a surgeon, but as a fellow human being. "I don't know if he'll be able to hum right away, Eleanor," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I no longer tried to hide. But we're going to do everything in our power to get him back to his garden. Tell me about his roses. And so she did. As she spoke about Arthur, about their life, their jokes, their shared silences, I wasn't just listening. I was learning. I was realizing that my father's words weren't an accusation. They were a plea to be seen, to be known, beyond the grand drama of my career. My decision was no longer about how to apologize. It was about how to listen. It was about going home and learning to hear the humming. I didn't call first. I drove straight from the hospital, my mind quiet for the first time in weeks. The gnawing anxiety had been replaced by a fragile, tentative sense of purpose. When I got to my parents' house, I found him where I knew he'd be, in his workshop in the garage. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust and varnish, a smell that was the backdrop to my entire childhood. He was standing over his workbench, sanding a piece of dark cherry wood, his movements slow and deliberate. The returned lathe was in the corner, covered by a dusty sheet, an elephant in the room. He heard me enter but didn't look up. He just kept sanding, the rhythmic rasp filling the silence. I didn't start with an apology, with an excuse, with any of the words I had rehearsed and discarded. I just stood there, watching him, breathing in the scent of his world. After a few minutes that felt like an eternity, I walked over to the bench. "That's a beautiful piece of wood," I said, my voice quiet. He grunted in response, his eyes still fixed on his work. I reached out and gently ran my hand over the smooth, cool surface. "What are you making?" He finally stopped sanding and looked at me. His eyes were wary, guarded. "A jewelry box. For your mother." We stood in silence for another moment. The old me would have filled it, would have forced the issue, would have tried to solve the problem. The new me waited. I had learned from Eleanor that the most important conversations happen in the spaces between the words. Finally, I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest like a frightened bird. "Dad," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "You were right. It was all I could manage, but it was everything." His expression softened, the hard lines around his mouth easing. He saw the exhaustion in my face, the genuine pain in my eyes. He saw that I wasn't there to defend myself. I was there to surrender. "I spent so much time trying to be a great surgeon," I continued, the words tumbling out now, raw and unpolished. "I thought I was doing something so important, but I missed the most important thing. I was so busy listening to other people's hearts. I completely forgot to listen to yours." A single tear traced a path through the sawdust on his cheek. He put down the sandpaper and turned to face me fully. He didn't say, "It's okay." He didn't say, "I forgive you." He just opened his arms. I stepped into his embrace, a hug I hadn't realized I was starving for. I buried my face in his shoulder, smelling the familiar scent of wood and oil, and I cried. I cried for the missed birthdays, for the stilted phone calls, for the untouched cake, and for the profound, stupid blindness that had kept me from seeing the man who had always been my rock. We didn't solve anything in that moment, not with words, but we healed something. When we finally pulled apart, he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and nodded toward the house. "Your mother saved you a piece of that cake," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "It's probably a bit dry now." We walked into the house together, and as he sliced into the dense, chocolatey layers, it felt less like a belated birthday and more like a new beginning. My life didn't change overnight. I still perform complex surgeries. I still work long hours. But something fundamental inside me has shifted. The hum of the machines in the no longer sounds like control. It sounds like a prelude to the life that happens after. I take the time now to sit with families like Eleanor's, to learn about the gardens and the humming and the small, precious details of the lives I'm trying to save. My work has become richer, more meaningful because it is now connected to the whole person, not just the failing organ. My relationship with my father has been rebuilt, not on grand gestures, but on a foundation of small, quiet moments. I go to his workshop and just watch him work. We sit on the porch and talk about nothing in particular. We are learning to listen to each other's silence. The other day, while helping him in his garden, I heard him humming a simple, cheerful tune. The sound was more beautiful and more healing than any perfectly restored heartbeat I had ever produced. I had spent my life learning how to mend the intricate tissues of the human heart, but it took my own father's breaking one to teach me how to finally heal my own.